And I'm very happy to introduce my former colleague, Nicole Small, who's you've already seen this morning. So I don't think I need to introduce her, other than to say that she was a very valued member of my team when I was at the MHRA, and it's good to see she's found a home in an interesting and dynamic organisation like this. So she's going to talk about beyond compliance. Now, I have all sorts of things that I understand into beyond compliance, which I suspect is not what Nicole's going to talk about. So I'll let her take the stage and talk you through it.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I feel like Magnus Madison. I started, so I finished. So I'm about to finish. So yeah, you're right, the title is probably misleading, so always ignore the title, that's not the important thing. Is it moving on? Okay. So I worked for the regulator for 20 years, and no matter how long or short your history is with MedTech industry, I think we've all got some incredible stories to tell. And in the next 15 or so minutes, I'm going to try to share some of those experience of working for a regulator, namely the MHRA, the UK regulator, in both the pre-market and the post-market phase. There was a lot of interaction with manufacturers. I'm looking at Graham, not you deliberately, but there was a hell of a lot. I know, you should know. No, we've got a good relationship, Graham. So there's a lot of interaction with manufacturers, representatives, but equally, we worked quite closely with regulators across the globe. And apologies if I keep saying we, because I no longer work at MHRA, but after 20 years, it is a little bit of a habit. And it's to answer two questions, hopefully, today, is, well, what do regulators want? And we've heard a little bit from Paul a bit about that today, as well as how and when to communicate and what pathways are available to seek advice from regulators in both pre-market or pre-submission, as well as the post-market phase. But also I want to share some small lessons learned to make that interaction more effective for you. So just a quick Slido. Hopefully you've still got Slido uploaded. Oh no, it was 0. Oh, that was quick. What stops you from seeking pre-submission? This is formal advice. So Paul Batchelder's alluded to this previously. What stops you from seeking pre-submission advice or feedback from your regulator? So quickly tap into your Slido. Well, that's good, because then I thought I was just going to go home if you didn't know I could. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. So as a regulator, or any of the regulators, I think they were generally known by a number of names and very, very polite, nothing rude in anything. But watchdog, the police, enforcers came to mind throughout my 20-year career, and probably if there are other regulators sitting in the audience, they probably come up with some other names too. But I think, it doesn't matter if you are starting out in MedTech, you're new, you're a startup, you're an SME, whatever, or a well-established manufacturer, and or whatever. So you may or may not have approached a regulator to any depth. And for some in our audience, you'll have worked, as I said, worked very closely with them. But one key message from today, in terms of engaging with the regulator, is they share the same goal as all of us, and that is to ensure the safe access of MedTech products that make a difference to patients and the public. So to those nicknames or to those tags I showed on the previous slide, I would also add enabler to that name as well. So I think, again, the key message here is don't be reluctant, don't be hesitant to speak to your regulator, whether it be FDA, BfArM, or even MHRA. And, you've heard from a lot of ex-regulators here today, and quite frankly, there's a chance you're probably sitting in the vicinity of an ex-regulator now, and you can put your hands up if you like, Fez and Neil, it's entirely up to you. So, we've talked all throughout today, you've got the funding, James talked about strategy, etc. And as I said, now it's time to send in your submission to your regulator or your notification. And there are a number of touch points across the product life cycle or your technical readiness levels to communicate with your regulator and engage with them about your submission. And obviously, depending on their pre-market and post-market activities and responsibilities, they do differ slightly. But in general, I picked on 4 regulators here across the globe. In general, they are pretty much the same in terms of their vision or their mission. So the role is not just to ensure the regulations are met and to knock on your door perhaps when something goes wrong, but they're also part of this system, this ecosystem of support to access new technologies without compromising on safety. So I wanted to pick, as I said, a couple of lessons learned, and this is about the pre-market phase. So if we just take a look, and this is public available information about MHRA in 2021, 12 clinical investigation notifications were objected for a number of reasons, but the main reason keeps coming up over and over again is the data was not submitted in the statutory time period. So if you're doing a CI in Great Britain, it's basically 60 days. If you're doing it in Northern Ireland, it's 45 to 65 days. And again, some of those grounds of grounds for objection, and for me, I was looking at the technical data. I was not looking at any of the clinical, but the grounds for objection that I came across, and we talked about it today, is that sometimes the applicable essential principles, or your GSPRs, the data was not there to support that particular requirement. There was little or no summary about the testing, and then even sometimes there was no explanation of a deviation to a standard that was well established within MedTech. And what I mean by that, if you're using a designated or harmonized standard, if you deviate from that, you would expect to see, well, what's that deviation? What does it mean in terms of the safety and performance profile? And the other thing, was sort of like basic, was sometimes you just couldn't link the data in front of you to the investigational device. So if you look at the data again from FDA for the same period in 2021, they did 40 notices of non-compliance. Now this data mixes up medicines as well as medical devices, but again, it's similar themes that MHRA is seeing about failing to submit information within statutory timelines or adequate data to support the submission. And again, there's data there, was it 30% of 510K submissions are not accepted for initial review. They're not getting over that minimum threshold of acceptance that the FDA and other regulators place on a notification or submission. And I know this sometimes can come across a bit crude, but costs. Now I've picked on 3 here, and these are for the high-risk medical devices, and I've picked on class 2B implantables, etc. And you can see, I absolutely accept this number is small in the scheme of things about how much a clinical investigation can cost, and particularly if you do it in numerous clinical sites. I know Michael alluded to that today as well. But I think the cost to patients that want better outcomes with a potential device or MedTech products that's got a better benefit risk profile or state of the art, as we've referred to today, I mean, that's just priceless. Delaying a CI that has that potential promising impact on patients because the data's not there or the submission's not been done in the right time, I think is really important to understand the impact on patients. So in the pre-market phase, there are many pathways to engagement depending on your regulator. And my colleague Paul today spoke about FDA and the Q submission, or their Q program. And so he talked about the de novo as well as 510K. But for other notifications, namely the PMA, there are also opportunities to speak to the FDA and do it in a structured manner, either by writing or you'll have a pre-submission meeting. And there's no fees for any of those pre-submission interactions with the FDA. Some of you may be aware from the EMA, they've just went out for expression of interest. And this isn't the expert panel scientific advice. So this is not the mandatory consultation procedure that's in the MDR or the IVDR. This is about an ad hoc opportunity to discuss with the panel prior to a clinical evaluation and or investigation. Now, it is a small pilot, it is free, But what they're aiming is come next year, early next year, the outcome of that pilot will mean that they'll have an efficient and effective procedure, so that when you're thinking of getting your clinical strategy or your clinical investigation submission in readiness, you can actually go to these expert panels for advice. And again, it's a structured way of doing it, and picking up on what Paul said, again, it's about asking the right questions. Equally, MHRA have their Innovator Accelerator program. So again, this is opportunities for people who are developing a product which uses new or novel technologies. So again, you can ring them up, you can write to them, and you can have pre-submission phone calls with them. In general, there is no fee, but when you look at the government's response, or MHRA's response to the consultation on fees, which is going to come in April 2023 this year, there is a new fee, and that's an optional fee. And as you can see there, it's going to cost you for regulatory advice or statistical review. But again, it's that opportunity to discuss the regulator to try and get your submission over that minimum acceptance of minimum review of acceptance. So there are so again, no cost there, but again, there's no cost to the extensive guidance out there that all the regulators have published. They're freely available, and whether or not it relates to a notification or a submission guidance for clinical investigators and sponsors, it is all out there for you to read. And I do accept for some regulators' websites, it is a bit hard to try and navigate and find it. So do call out to me if you have problems with that. I'm quite happy to help with that. So, we're all familiar with the 6 or even 7 C's of communication. And I think what I would add to that one is candor. Is to be truthful and honest with your regulator about your submission and your notification. And again, it's about having that effective relationship or communication with that regulator so that you can improve your time to market, getting your submission or your notification over the hurdle, basically, and getting it through that process so that it can get into patients and get into users and get into their lives and better outcomes. So key takeaways from that, again, I think Paul picked up on this, is review the submission guidance and prepare. I learned that from John Wilkinson a lot. As I said, there's a lot of guidance out there, even about how you approach a regulator and how you ask relevant, important questions. You've got to use that time and opportunity in the most effective way that you can. Hold structured dialogues, because you're going to get loads of questions if it's not structured. And I take what Paul said on board about having your subject matter expert part of that pre-submission meeting or phone call or whatever. Is just getting the right people in the room at the right time. Challenge with credibility. Now this is, you can't just turn around to a regulator and say, no, I don't agree with you. No, I'm not going to do that. What they'd like to see is evidence. You're all in the game of providing scientific, clinical and technical evidence. Challenge them with credibility, absolutely. And honestly, it works both ways. But back that up with significant and credible evidence if you're going to challenge the regulator on their decision. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But again, I can't emphasise enough, you must submit your submissions within statutory deadlines, and they all vary depending on the jurisdiction. So please be aware about those timelines. So for example, if I remember, if you're doing a clinical investigation in FDA, that's 30 days. As I said, if it's GB, it's 60 days. So there is a difference. So be aware about those statutory deadlines if they apply in the clinical site, country that you're conducting your CI. So I move on to my favourite bit, which is post-market surveillance, and that was my bread and butter for 20 years at the MHRA. And we're all hopefully familiar with the quality management system, which relates to your post-market surveillance. And I'm sorry for those, I've just picked on IVDR and MDR about what the PMS means and what does it mean in terms of updating your clinical performance or your evaluation or your benefit risk. But equally, it also, through the mechanisms in which post-market surveillance is intended, is the identification of when things go wrong with those trends in which you need to act on them as swiftly as possible. And PMS, I guess, is to answer those three questions. Is your device, your IVD, whatever, produced as intended, performing as intended, and still compatible with the state of the art that Michael spoke about this morning? So again, some lessons learned here, and you know, invariably, and unfortunately, I guess, when you place your product on the market, something goes wrong, whether it be manufacturing or assembly or use error, something goes wrong, you have to act on it, you have to communicate to your end customers. And some of the lessons, some of the issues that we found, or the MHRA found, came up quite common for an FSN or a field safety notice, that communication to your end customer, was the risks and the actions were not clear for the audience. Sometimes the risk was played down. I think in a complex distribution chain, the targeting on traceability, finding your customers when you've got multiple layers of distributors and things like that, can add to the poor response rate. But I absolutely accept that with the new MDR, with the MDR and the IVDR, that places greater responsibility, not just on the manufacturer, their representatives, but also the importers and distributors, to make sure that they all act when it comes to corrective action within the field. And so those solutions, tips for solutions, are effective FSCA strategy. It sounds so simple, but it's really about thinking about when you're going to go out and let the customers know there's a problem, and how you're going to do it, by what methodology, and that kind of thing. And there is an engagement pathway with many a regulator when it comes to a field safety action. And that is, you can discuss your draft field safety notice with the regulator. They're not there to write it for you. They're there to comment on it and to provide you with constructive advice. So I do suggest and recommend that you do engage early with your regulator when you're thinking about perhaps a very highly complex, very serious public threat action in the field. Again, follow guidance by the regulatory body. There's extensive guidance out there for field safety corrective action. But equally, seek knowledge, local knowledge. So, if you've got a UKRP or you've got an authorised representative or whatever, they've sometimes got some really good local knowledge about the distribution chain, the healthcare system, how to work with the regulator and when to do so. So do use those opportunities as well. When it comes to non-compliance, this is, when the people who are basically saying, your product, you might put it on the market, you think it was compliant, but actually it's not for whatever reason. And, I think engagement and communication is also possible at this stage when, when you're looking at non-compliance. And again, I just wanted to emphasise, and I put this in bold with the three chosen regulators here, is there's an emphasis, even when you are non-compliant, you're not meeting the law, there is an emphasis on supporting you back into compliance as quickly as possible, but never compromising on safety. So it's really important that even when you do, find yourself in non-compliance, the regulator, again, is there to help and support you back where relevant and appropriate. So again, just picking on there, MHRA, the statement there is they'll, provide you guidance how you can comply with the regulations. FDA, they're there to correct and prevent violations. But don't forget, all these regulators have enforcement powers, so whilst they're trying to get you back into compliance as swiftly as possible and safely as possible, there are, actions that they can take. So whether or not it be a warning letter or a penalty or whatever, that is available to them. So engage quickly with them, communicate effectively with them, work with them, and respond quickly to get your product, your MedTech, back into compliance as quickly as possible. So, as I said, that was only a quick overview of regulatory engagement. But so the key takeaway from today is, again, we've heard from numerous speakers today, from different organisations, and I believe the regulator, no matter where they are part of the regulatory support. They are a key player in supporting you and guiding you. So wherever possible, Develop those deep, meaningful, multi-level relationships wherever you can, whether it be by phone, email, or whatever. They are there to help you. Again, utilise those pathways to feedback and advice as early as possible, okay? And keep abreast of the guidelines, extensive guidelines about submissions and notifications that are out there. And I just want to end on the point is that I think, you know, we all came into this industry to make a difference to patients and public's health. And it's that positive impact that, you know, makes me still want to work in, you know, in this particular field and working with Element. And I think the only way we continue to do that is if we all work together to achieve that. So thank you for listening.
Okay, questions? There we are, you've got them right in front of you. How long does it take to get a response from regulators? How long is a piece of string?
You beat me to it. So, you know, so if you're doing an FOI, freedom of information, we know there's statutory, you know, deadlines for that 20 days. I couldn't really answer to it, but, you know, it's variable, but when we all worked at MHRA, and I'm looking at Neil and Fezza, you know, we did it as quickly as possible. So, yeah, I think it's as long as a piece of string, but I would hope any regulator would respond timely, but more importantly, you know, giving you the right information, quality information. Oh God, what's that?
Right. Communications with the registry apply equally to communications with CAB notified bodies?
Yeah, I think that's a comment. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Definitely.
Yeah, I think all my experience of where people have tried to pull the wool is it's been self-defeating in the end, I think, because if ultimately the truth usually outs, and the longer it takes to come out, the worse the consequences for everybody, actually. And it's at the regulator as well, everybody suffers. So the sooner you can actually engage constructively in sorting what is a problem out, the better.
I'll quickly answer that one. Yeah, it's not just high risk, any FSN. You can engage with the MHRA or any regulator. But yeah, I hear that comment about the early stage not being so positive. Oh.
Right, we've still got a little bit of time, have we?
Go on.
Or have we?
Go on, Neil.
Neil. We've been waiting for this one, Neil. So.
You've been very quiet.
You've been very quiet all the time.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to share a recent experience about an FSN. It was a simple matter of a date, an expiry date, or a used before date, which had been mistakenly put down as 2022 when it should have said 2025. So there was no danger to anybody or anything at all. And it took 8 weeks to get any sense out of MHRA. They couldn't seem to understand that there was no danger. They didn't understand that you could relabel. They wanted to pull everything back and destroy it. And getting any sense out of the people that we even spoken to on the phone was a nightmare. And you only had to go to a different phone call with a different person to get a completely different set of guidance. So much as I believe in everything you've said about how it should work, I actually don't feel it is working, and I think we've lost so much experience and understanding within the MHRA in particular that we're having problems that we really don't need. Oh, the other thing they sent me to was an 8-page form to fill in, of which probably only 3 boxes were relevant. So I wrote my own, and they accepted it anyway. So.
I mean, you know, I haven't worked at MHRA for 12 months, but, you know, there are really good people there. There always will be, whether or not they come or go, and new ones, new talent. And I think the important thing is to feed that back to the regulator. It doesn't matter if it's MHRA, FDA, is you know, they work for you as well, you know, so that, you know, if there are problems, you need to tell them early, and hopefully they'll put something in place to resolve that.
I couldn't possibly comment, but I do think it's important and possibly lost on broader government. If you've got an industrial strategy that involves life sciences, regulatory competence is a huge component of that, and not to be taken lightly. And the MHRA has got a hugely strong history, and it would be tragic for the industrial strategy in this area if that wasn't to be maintained into the future.